Welcome back to Still Unanswered. I'm Elena Marlowe. Tonight, we go to a small clearing in the Bavarian woods, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, where a single farm changed how Germany remembers an unsolved murder. It's called Hinterkaifeck, and what happened there in late March 1922 is equal parts true crime and folklore. For days afterward, someone appears to have lived with the corpses. 6 people were killed. No one was ever charged.
Hi, Elena. I'm Matthias Kessler. I study early 20th century homicide investigations, and I've spent a lot of time in those archival files from Munich and the local villages. Hinterkaifeck is the kind of case that keeps historians and criminologists awake because it sits at the crossroads of damaged forensics, social shame, and rural isolation. It's a difficult one to look at, emotionally and technically.
Right. So let's start with the image that haunts most people. A killer who may have stayed on the farm after the murders, feeding livestock, lighting the stove, even eating from the pantry. That detail is one of the reasons this case keeps circulating in everything from scholarly papers to ghost stories. But, Matthias, can you first paint the place for listeners? What does Hinterkaifeck actually mean, and how isolated was that farm?
Hinterkaifeck literally means behind Kaifeck. It wasn't a village, it was a single farmstead about a kilometer north of the small hamlet called Kaifeck, set between Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen. The farmhouse itself dated to the 1860s and sat surrounded by dense woods and fields, with no direct neighbors in immediate sight. In 1922, after World War I, rural Bavaria had a lot of people drifting through, but isolated farms like this, cash-poor, asset-rich, self-reliant, could go days without visitors. That isolation explains a lot. No casual passerby heard screams, no neighbor popped in to interrupt a crime, and it made the farm a place where a human intruder could potentially remain unnoticed for days.
You can almost feel the hush. And that rural context matters. Post-WW1 economic hardship, ex-soldiers on the move. It's not just scenery. So who lived there? Let's meet the victims, the household at the time of the murders. Matthias?
There were 6 victims. The patriarch, Andreas Gruber, about 63. His wife, Cäzilia Gruber, about 72. Their daughter, Viktoria, 35. Viktoria's 2 children, Cäzilia, aged 7, and little Josef, about 2. And a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, 44, who had only been on the job a few hours that day. The family had a complicated reputation locally. Andreas was described as harsh and controlling, and, importantly, Andreas and Viktoria had been convicted of incest years earlier. That conviction and the rumor network around paternity, whether Josef was the son of the neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer or something else, are central to many motive theories.
The word victims feels important here. Our show always foregrounds the human cost. I'll linger on one of those details because it's unbearably human. Autopsy reports indicate that the 7-year-old, little Cäzilia, did not die instantly. She apparently lived for hours, and the autopsy noted she had torn out tufts of her own hair. It's hard to describe how chilling that image is. Matthias, do we know where she was found and what that suggests about the attacker's method?
Yes, 4 of the victims, Andreas, Cäzilia Sr., Viktoria, and Cäzilia Jr., were found stacked under hay in the barn. The two youngest inside the house, the toddler Josef in his bassinet, and the new maid Maria in her room. The medical examinations concluded blunt and sharp force trauma to the head, consistent with what we call a mattock, a type of pickaxe or farm tool. The barn arrangement and the injuries suggest the victims may have been led out, one by one, or at least removed to the barn after being struck. The little girl's prolonged suffering, tearing hair out, indicates she was conscious for hours. That adds an almost unimaginable cruelty, or perhaps an emergency situation where the attacker left her alive for a time.
It's unbearably tragic. Let's step back to the weeks before the murders, because a lot of the eeriness comes not just from the crime itself, but from the events leading up to it. Attic noises, missing keys, and that maid who quit because she thought the place was haunted. Can you walk us through those prelude details?
Certainly. In the months before March 1922, the farm had several strange events. A previous maid, Crescens Rige, who worked there from late 1920 into 1921, reported hearing footsteps and noises in the attic and became so frightened she quit, describing the house as haunted. In March 1922, Andreas found a Munich newspaper on the property he hadn't subscribed to. Neighbors didn't receive it either, so it just appeared there. Most unsettling, a few days before the murders, Andreas discovered single sets of footprints in fresh snow coming from the forest toward the house, and with no return tracks, as if someone had come to the farm and not left. Around that time, a house key also went missing, and newspapers had been taken from the mailbox. These were reported informally to neighbors, but apparently not to police.
Wow, footprints that don't return. There's a lot to unpack there. Listeners, that detail fuels one of the enduring images of this case. The possibility that someone was living inside the house, maybe in the attic, before the murders. Some people interpret that as paranormal, which we'll touch on later. But first, Matthias, walk us through the night itself, March 31st, 1922, how investigators reconstructed what happened.
The timeline is fairly straightforward in outline. Friday, March 31st, the maid Maria arrived that day and the family was seen alive. Sometime late that night or into the early hours of April 1st, the killings occurred. The barn clock reportedly stopped around 2:30 a.m., which is often used as a rough time marker. The 4 adults and the 7-year-old ended up piled in the barn. The maid and the toddler were killed in the house. Injuries were caused by heavy blows to the head, again consistent with a mattock. The pattern, barn bodies and indoor bodies, suggests someone moved through the farm, killing in multiple locations, and, in at least one case, the child was not killed immediately.
Let me pause you there, Matthias. The mattock, this farm tool, was later discovered during the demolition of the farm in 1923, correct? And it reportedly still had dried blood. Is that accurate?
Yes. During demolition in 1923, the murder weapon, believed to be a mattock from the farm, was found in the attic or loft area and reportedly had dried blood on it. A penknife was also found in the barn hay at that time, though its ownership was never established. Unfortunately, many physical items and even some skulls that were removed for examination were later lost or destroyed during the war years, which complicates modern forensic possibilities.
So the farm was demolished less than a year after the murders. They took the building down and put up a memorial cross nearby. That feels like an attempt to close a wound, but the questions kept coming. One of the strangest elements, again, was that after the murders, someone continued to tend the animals, milking cows, feeding livestock, and keeping a fire going. Neighbors noticed smoke from the chimney after the presumed time of death. How did people interpret that at the time?
Neighbors were deeply unsettled. The fact that animals were tended suggested someone had remained on the property for 2 to 4 days after the murders. Witnesses reported the dog tied up and barking while the house stayed silent. A mechanic who visited on April 4 fixed an engine and worked several hours while the dog barked and no family members appeared. Neighbor boys, who were sent to check, reported seeing no one initially. When adults finally broke into the barn, they found the bodies. The behavior feeding livestock instead of fleeing with potential loot argued against a simple robbery. That's why investigators lean toward a personal motive rather than a burglary.
There's an almost cinematic and bone-cold image there. Someone living among the dead, tending cows while the village suspects nothing. Listeners, that is a large part of why this case migrated from courtrooms into legends. Okay, Matthias, let's talk about discovery. The chain of events from April 1st to the bodies being found on April 4th. Tell us how the alarm finally raised and what happened when neighbors arrived.
On April 1st, 2 coffee sellers came to the farm to take an order and got no answer. They saw the yard and an open machine room door but left. The family did not appear at church on Sunday, April 2nd, which was unusual. On Tuesday, April 4th, mechanic Albert Hoffner came to repair an engine and worked for hours with no one present. That afternoon, neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer sent his son Johann and stepson Josef Dick to check the farm. They reported nothing. Schlittenbauer then went with neighbors Michael Pöll and Jakob Sigg, forced open the barn, and found the 4 bodies under the hay. They then found Maria and little Josef inside the house. After the discovery, villagers flocked to the scene and sadly contaminated the crime scene, walking through blood and straw, moving bodies, and searching for money long before Munich investigators arrived.
That contamination is crucial. It's one reason, perhaps the main reason, the crime stayed unsolved. The scene was compromised before professionals from Munich could secure it. Matthias, can you describe how Munich investigators handled the case and what the limits of early 20th century forensics meant for the investigation?
The investigation was led by Munich authorities, with Inspector Georg Reingruber taking charge and court physician Johann Baptist Aumüller performing autopsies in the barn on April 5th. They documented blunt and sharp force trauma consistent with a Mattock and removed skulls for further work. Those skulls were later lost in wartime. The early forensics were limited. No fingerprints or advanced crime scene protocols as we understand them today. The extensive contamination by villagers destroyed footprints, blood patterns, and potential trace evidence. Despite interrogating hundreds of people, traveling craftsmen, vagrants, neighbors, and relatives, authorities could not produce a chargeable suspect. The investigators noted that large sums of money reportedly remained on the property, which undermined a robbery motive. The missing weapon at first and the later discovery of the Mattock during demolition complicated the forensic trail.
So the forensics were what they were, the best they could do in the 1920s, and then you add in villagers walking through the scene. It's complicated. Before we go into suspects, Matthias, I want to pause on an image you gave earlier, the barn bodies piled under hay. Investigators believed the victims may have been lured one at a time to the barn. How does that detail shape our understanding of the killer's relationship to the family, or the level of premeditation?
If victims were indeed lured one by one, several inferences follow. First, the killer likely had enough trust or perceived authority to call family members into the barn, telling them, perhaps, there was work to do or some explanation they would accept. Second, it suggests familiarity with the farm layout and timing, which points toward someone from the local community or someone who knew farm life well. Third, luring people separately and killing them one at a time shows deliberation and control, either premeditated or opportunistic with a calm execution afterward. Combined with the later caretaking of animals, the pattern implies the perpetrator was not an impulsive outsider, but rather someone comfortable on the property.
Comfort on the property. Right. That phrase is ominous. Okay, let's move into the suspect theories. We'll try them on one at a time. First, and perhaps the most discussed, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor. He had a relationship with Viktoria and was often described as the likely father of little Josef. Matthias, outline why many people focus on him.
Lorenz Schlittenbauer was a neighbor farmer who had been romantically linked with Viktoria after his first wife's death. Many locals believed he was Josef's father. There were disputes between him and the Grubers over child support and paternity. Suspicion centers on several facts. Schlittenbauer was involved in the discovery. He sent boys to check the farm, later accompanied others to force open the barn, and then entered the house. Some accounts say he was able to unlock a door from the outside when a missing house key had been reported, which raised eyebrows about access. He handled bodies and entered rooms where, arguably, a killer might not have. Behavior some found suspicious. Add to that motive: anger or humiliation over paternity, social shame, and ongoing conflict with the domineering Andreas.
That's persuasive on paper, but many suspected people live in small villages and have arguments. What are the counter-arguments? Why wasn't Schlittenbauer charged?
Despite suspicion, Schlittenbauer was never charged. Investigators questioned him, and he remained a person of interest for years, but evidence was circumstantial. He continued to live in the area and spoke about the case at times, which some argue a guilty person, if deeply conscious of wrongdoing, might not do openly. More importantly, there was no forensic tie. No confession, no witnesses placing him at the scene during the murders, and given the contaminated crime scene, there was nothing forensic to pin him to. In the early 2000s, a modern profiling review suggested the killer was likely someone from the victim's immediate circle. But the reviewers still didn't publicly name anyone, likely out of deference to surviving relatives and because the evidence fell short.
It's one of those moments where motive and opportunity almost line up, but the burden of proof wasn't met. So then we turn to the family itself, the scandal of the proven incest between Andreas and Viktoria in 1915. How does that conviction and the shattered reputations influence the range of suspects and motives? Matthias?
The incest conviction of Andreas and Viktoria in 1915 was an enormous social stigma in rural Catholic Bavaria. It would have been common knowledge in surrounding villages and could have created enemies, shame, and long-standing resentment. Villagers debated Josef's paternity. Was he the child of Lorenz Schlittenbauer, or might Andreas himself have fathered him through continued incest? That uncertainty feeds several theories. Revenge or honor motives by someone like Schlittenbauer or another male who felt wronged, or a desire within the community to erase the scandal. There's also a conspiracy idea, one that claims Viktoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, survived the war and returned to kill. But there's no credible evidence Karl survived. Military records and accounts support his death in France. So the incest and paternity confusion are central because they create a plausible personal motive, but they don't point decisively at any single person.
By the way, those conspiracy claims about Karl Gabriel are, it seems, the kind of rumor that grows in unsolved cases. It's dramatic, appealing, but not supported by primary records. Listeners, take note of how rumor and evidence diverge here. Let's talk about other suspects who were on investigators' lists: former farmhands, local men who knew the farm, and a few names that keep popping up in the files: the Bickler brothers, Georg Siegel, Peter Weber. Give us a sense of why these men were considered. Matthias?
Anton and Karl Bichler were men who had worked on the farm. Anton, in particular, had allegedly said the Grubers should be dead, according to the former maid Crescens. She also noted that the farm dog, which usually barked at strangers, did not bark at Anton. This kind of testimony makes people suspicious. Georg Siegel had a reputation for stealing small items and reportedly admitted to carving the handle of a mattock and knowing where it was stored. Obviously, that ties him to knowledge of tools on the farm. Peter Weber is interesting because a co-worker, Josef Betz, later claimed Weber had once talked about murdering Andreas and robbing the family back in the winter of 1919-1920. Yet, for all of these men, the ties are circumstantial: threats, access, prior thefts, or talk. There's no conclusive proof placing them at Hinterkaifeck on the night in question.
So we're repeatedly facing motive and opportunity, but without the forensic or eyewitness key that would transform suspicion into conviction. There's also the idea of a drifter or ex-soldier committing the crime, someone passing through post-WWI Bavaria. How seriously did investigators take that theory, and what arguments support or undermine it?
Given the era post-WW1 Bavaria, there were many unemployed veterans and drifters. Investigators certainly questioned traveling craftsmen and vagrants. A passing thief or ex-soldier could plausibly have broken in and killed the family. However, the nature of the crime, luring people into a barn, the calm after the murders tending animals, knowledge of where things were kept, argues more for someone familiar with farm life. Additionally, the fact that valuables reportedly remained on the property and that the killer apparently stayed to care for animals makes a random robbery less convincing. So the drifter theory was considered, but was less persuasive than an inside job hypothesis.
That inside job hypothesis, the idea that the killer was someone within the victim's immediate social circle, gained more traction with a 2007 cold case review, correct? Tell us about that.
Yes. In 2007, a team of German Police Academy students and instructors re-examined the case using modern profiling techniques. They concluded that the killer was very likely someone from the victim's immediate social circle rather than a total stranger. They developed a prime suspect, but did not publicly name that person, reportedly out of respect for surviving family members and because the evidence still lacked the legal standard to press charges. That review reinforces what many earlier investigators suspected. The perpetrator was probably local and familiar with the farm, but even modern profiling couldn't produce a smoking gun. That review reinforces what many earlier investigators suspected. The perpetrator was probably local and familiar with the farm, but even modern profiling couldn't produce a smoking gun.
Right. So even with contemporary behavioral science applied to the historical files, the answer remained elusive. I want to shift a bit and talk about how this case moved into the realm of folklore and the paranormal. The attic noises, the maid who fled calling the house haunted, those details are often amplified in retellings. How did local belief systems and rural superstition shape the story, Matthias?
In early 20th century rural Bavaria, Catholic belief mixed with folk superstition. People were used to reading omens in animal behavior or attributing strange structural noises to spirits. The earlier maid's description of footsteps and the feeling of being watched likely fed into that cultural framework. Locals speaking about a haunted house may have been interpreting intruder activity or simply structural noises through a supernatural lens. Those beliefs may have discouraged the Grubers from thinking in strictly criminal terms. They might have expected supernatural explanations or been embarrassed to ask for official help. After the murders, storytellers and sensationalist media amplified the haunting narrative, blending documented oddities with speculative ghost stories.
So folklore provided a lens that sometimes obscured human causes. But just to be perfectly clear, our review of sources shows that what looks paranormal often has simple human explanations. A person living secretly on the farm, drafts, animals. We'll return to that myth-busting in a little while. Matthias, can you talk about the damage done to the investigation by the scene being trampled by curious locals? I think listeners should understand how that changed everything.
Absolutely. When villagers discovered the bodies, they reacted in ways typical for the time and place: shock, grief, and a desire to search for valuables or to understand. People walked through blood and straw, moved bodies, cooked in the kitchen, and disturbed evidence. Those actions destroyed the possibility of reconstructing footprints, blood spatter, or position details. Autopsies were performed in the barn, but many potentially crucial items, skulls removed and later lost, the murder weapon not documented until the demolition, were never preserved in a way modern investigators would accept. This contamination virtually guaranteed the investigation would rely on witness testimony and circumstantial links rather than forensic proof.
It's a maddening, almost preventable loss. If only local villagers had waited a short while. But of course, human reaction is what it is. Let's consider what we actually know versus what's myth. Lay out, if you will, a quick list. What are the core facts that are solid, and what tends to be exaggerated? Matthias?
Core facts based on records. The murders occurred on March 31, 1922, discovered April 4. 6 victims: Andreas, Cäzilia Sr., Viktoria, Cäzilia Jr., Josef, and maid Maria. Bodies found in barn and house. Cause of death: multiple blows to the head consistent with a mattock. Pre-murder disturbances like attic noises, a mysterious newspaper, and footprints without returns. The murder weapon found during demolition in 1923. The farm demolished and a memorial cross erected nearby. Reasonably documented, but somewhat second-hand. Former maid statements about haunting and specific quotes attributed to locals. Reports from villagers about who did or did not bark at whom. Exaggerations and myths. Claims of occult ritual, Carl Gabriel definitely surviving the war, or anything portraying the crime as definitively supernatural. Sensational accounts often add ritual elements that are not supported by original files.
Good. Listeners, when you read a lurid retelling online, remember, bones of the case are fairly clear, but flesh is often rumor. Now, Matthias, I want to talk about motive in more psychological terms. If the killer was local and had a grudge, say Schlittenbauer or another neighbor, what does the behavior after the murders, the feeding of animals, the lingering, tell us about that person psychologically? Could it point to compulsion, remorse, or simply practical knowledge and comfort in the house?
It's difficult to diagnose from records, but there are several plausible psychological readings. Someone staying to care for animals could be extremely familiar with farm life, seeing animal care as routine, doing what they do without thinking. That familiarity could indicate the murderer was not an emotional, volatile stranger, but a local, comfortable in the space. Alternatively, lingering could suggest a compulsion, an inability to leave the scene because of obsession or to derive some control or comfort from maintaining normalcy. Remorse seems less likely if the killer stayed long enough to methodically tend animals. A remorseful person would be expected to flee rather than maintain household chores. But that's speculative. All we can say with confidence is the behavior argues for familiarity with farm routine and with the property.
And that's an important caveat. We can use behavior to form hypotheses, but without a confession or definitive forensic link, it remains a hypothesis. Okay, listeners, at this point, I want to ask you to imagine being in that village in April 1922. Close-knit, shame over incest, gossip, maybe a sense of protective silence. Matthias, what role might community silence have played in preventing the case from ever being solved?
Villages then, as now, are tightly woven networks. Gossip circulates, but people may avoid naming names when doing so would fracture community relationships or put them at personal risk. The incest stigma could make people protective or judgmental in equal measure. Some might quietly suspect who was capable. Some might avoid telling authorities because they distrusted outside officials. And others might simply accept a kind of communal silence. There's also the possibility of fear of retaliation. All of these dynamics can constrain what witnesses say and to whom. The result is that the police get fragmented, cautious testimony rather than the explosive confession that solves some crimes.
Yeah. And when you combine that with the crude forensic tools of the era and the contaminated scene, the practical chances of a courtroom resolution were small. Let's talk briefly about the media and the case's legacy, how Hinterkaifeck became a story retold in books, documentaries, and yes, podcasts. Why does it endure? Matthias.
Several reasons. The premise itself is chilling. A family wiped out on an isolated farm, someone perhaps living with the corpses. That hook lends itself to dramatic retelling. Then there's the human tragedy, children, a new maid who arrived that day, and a 7-year-old who apparently begged or suffered for hours. Add in the social texture, incest convictions, post-war instability, and rural superstition, and you have layers that invite interpretation. The case's unsolved status is also crucial. Humans seek closure, and when a case resists closure, it becomes a cultural magnet. Finally, the mixture of cold case sleuthings and paranormal speculation has made Hinterkaifeck appealing to both serious researchers and popular storytellers, keeping it alive in public consciousness.
It's the kind of story that invites amateur detectives and armchair profilers. We should be careful. Fascination can turn into exploitation if we aren't mindful of the victim's humanity. Matthias, the 2007 review you mentioned earlier, modern profiling suggested a local, but you said they didn't name anyone. What does that reticence tell us about the balance between investigative curiosity and respect for living relatives?
It shows professional prudence. Profilers can identify likely characteristics of a perpetrator age range, familiarity with farming, social proximity. But naming a suspect based on profiling and archival circumstantial evidence risks defamation of the dead and distress for surviving family. It's a matter of legal and ethical responsibility. That team's choice to withhold names suggests that while they felt confident about the general profile, they didn't believe the documentary evidence rose to the level of proving an individual's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. In cases this old, that's often the right call.
I agree. We owe the victims and surviving kin restraint. Before we move to our closing reflections, let's run through some of the alternatives listeners often ask about. The idea that the maid's reports of being watched were true and that someone had lived in the attic for weeks. The suggestion that the killer had ritual reasons or that wartime trauma played a role. Can we speak to each briefly, Matthias, and separate plausible from unlikely?
Sure. The idea that someone lived in the attic for days or weeks is plausible in a practical sense. Footprints with no return tracks, missing keys, and attic noises could indicate an intruder hiding on the property. A human explanation, someone covertly inhabiting the house, fits many facts. Claims of ritual reasons or occult symbolism, however, lack support in primary documents. Such elements appear later in sensational retellings rather than in the original investigation files. As for wartime trauma, the post-WW1 environment, veterans drifting, economic hardship, creates a context where violence may be more likely, but it doesn't point at an individual cause. In short, clandestine human presence is plausible. Ritualistic reasons are not supported by the evidence. Societal aftershocks of the war provide context, but are not a concrete motive.
Thank you. That clarifies a lot. We're coming toward the end of our episode, but I want us to take a moment for a few quiet reflections. Some ethical and historical points we try to keep front and center on Still Unanswered. Matthias?
We should remember the victims as people, not just as elements of a mystery. The Grubers Andreas and Cäzilia Sr. and Viktoria, and the children, Cäzilia and Josef, and Maria the maid, all had lives complicated by poverty, shame, and the rhythms of rural work. The historical context, post-war distress, social taboos like incest, and village dynamics matters because it shaped both how this family lived and how the community responded after they died. Finally, we should acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and refrain from turning real people into caricatures for the sake of a spooky story.
Well said. I'd add that Hinterkaifeck is a reminder of how easily truth can be lost by time, by war, and by human reaction. Skulls sent to Munich were later destroyed or lost in the war. Witness memories shift, a crime scene is trampled, and a village chooses silence. All those forces conspire to bury answers. Matthias, if you had to weigh probabilities based only on the archival patterns and without naming names, what would you say is the most likely profile of the killer?
Based on the pattern, Someone male, familiar with the farm, comfortable with livestock and routines, someone socially proximate to the family, so a neighbor or former farmhand. The killer likely had a personal motive, anger, humiliation, or a dispute tied to the incest conviction or paternity scandal, rather than a purely opportunistic robbery. The behavior afterwards, tending animals, supports familiarity rather than random violence. But, and this is crucial, this is a probabilistic profile, not proof. There is no definitive forensic link to seal the case.
Probable profile, not proof. That's the line listeners need to keep in mind. Now I want to give you, Matthias, one last chance to tell listeners what you personally found most haunting when you worked the files.
What stayed with me was small human detail. The toddler Josef, the new maid who was killed the day she arrived, and the 7-year-old suffering. Those are not facts to be fetishized for mystery. They are human tragedies. Also haunting is how quickly the community response, shock and curiosity destroyed physical traces that might have produced answers. The combination of social shame, rudimentary forensics, and human reaction created the perfect conditions for this kind of unsolvable case to endure. That's what I thought about when I left the archive.
Yeah. I think when historians say a case resists closure, sometimes they mean that the social fabric refuses to give up its secrets. We have a short segment coming up where we'll ask listeners a question. If you had access to a time machine for one day at Hinterkaifeck, what moment would you observe? Before the murders, the days after, or the moment of discovery? Think about it while we close. Matthias, any final caveats or things we should avoid repeating as gospel when we talk about Hinterkaifeck?
Yes, avoid repeating rumors as fact. Don't present supernatural interpretations as evidence. Be careful with claims about Karl Gabriel surviving the war. Those are unsubstantiated. And respect descendants and the victims. This was a real family, not a horror movie premise. Use the archival facts, distinguish speculation clearly, and keep a sober tone.
Good. We'll do that. Okay, listeners, a few last notes. The farm was demolished in 1923. A memorial cross marks the site. The Mattock was found during demolition. Hundreds were questioned over the decades. In 2007, profiling again pointed toward a local perpetrator, but no one was charged. Everyone directly involved is now dead, and the truth, if it still exists, lies in statements, memories, and fragments of evidence scattered across time. Matthias, thank you for joining me. This has been careful, illuminating work.
Thank you, Elena. It's always a difficult case to return to, but keeping these histories clear and grounded matters. Thank you for the careful approach.
And thank you to our listeners for spending this hour with Still Unanswered. If you want to read more about Hinterkaifeck, we'll link the primary sources and the overviews we used, Wikipedia's summary, grim evidence, cryptic confessions, and other translated materials, so you can assess the evidence yourself. One final invitation. If you had one day to observe Hinterkaifeck in 1922, which day would you choose? Send us your thoughts. We'll be back next week with another case that refuses to be solved. Until then, keep asking the questions. Oh, Matthias, one last word?
Remember the victims. Pause.
Remember the victims. Good night.